On a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring, 16-year-old Caleb packed a small day bag, laced up his worn sneakers, and told his parents he was going for a quick hike. The forest trail he chose was one he had walked dozens of times before. It wound through the edge of town, a familiar path that offered a short climb to a ridge overlook, where teenagers often sat to watch the sun dip behind the trees. Caleb wasn't the type to take risks, at least not in the eyes of his parents. He was dependable, polite, and carried himself with a maturity beyond his years. That made what happened next so difficult for anyone to make sense of. Because when the sun sank that evening, Caleb never came home. At first, his parents didn't panic. He had mentioned being out until dusk before. But when darkness fell and his phone went unanswered, worry began to set in. By the time midnight arrived with no sign of him and no return call, panic took over. His father drove to the trailhead, headlights cutting across the gravel lot. Caleb's car was still parked neatly in its space, locked, as if he had intended only a brief walk. His parents alerted the authorities immediately. Within the hour, local deputies and a small search team arrived, flashlights casting narrow beams into the dense wall of trees. Searchers moved quickly, calling his name into the night. The trail was well marked and typically safe, but what unsettled the first responders was how abruptly the search turned up nothing. There were no discarded items, no broken branches leading off the path, not even a set of fresh footprints to follow. It was as if the woods had absorbed him. In missing person cases, the first 24 hours are critical. Caleb's disappearance seemed to leap past those hours before they had even begun. By sunrise, volunteers had joined deputies, fanning out into clearings, ravines, and creek beds. His friends showed up, still in yesterday's clothes, combing the familiar overlooks where they had once shared snacks and jokes with him. They called his name again and again, their voices echoing into a silence that pressed heavier with each passing hour. To those who knew the terrain, it made little sense. Caleb wasn't deep in the wilderness. He was on a trail where families hiked with children and retirees walked their dogs. The idea that he could simply vanish seemed impossible, yet the forest gave nothing back. Helicopters were dispatched by afternoon, sweeping across the tree canopy. From above, the terrain looked deceptively calm, like a sea of green rolling endlessly over the hills. But from the ground, searchers described the forest as a maze. Sections of rock outcroppings jutted up like walls, and undergrowth formed natural barriers. It was easy to see how someone could become disoriented. Still, Caleb had been hiking here since childhood. Friends remembered him as the one who always carried a compass, who teased others for not remembering the trails. Getting lost didn't fit his profile. Theories started to build almost immediately. Some believed he may have slipped near the ridge and injured himself, trapped somewhere just out of sight. Others speculated he might have wandered off the trail chasing something, a deer, a shortcut, or even a stray thought of adventure. His parents, however, rejected the idea. Caleb was careful, cautious, the kind who texted if he would be home late. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't the type to ignore responsibility. As the first day turned into the second, the search radius widened. Rescue dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the ground. At first, handlers were optimistic. The dogs picked up a faint trail near the trailhead, but within less than a mile, the scent was gone. On rocky terrain, it isn't unusual for a trail to go cold, but the speed at which it disappeared left handlers shaken. One rescuer later said it felt as though Caleb had walked into thin air. By the second night, tension in the command post was palpable. Volunteers crowded under tents, sipping burnt coffee, whispering fears no one wanted to say aloud. Parents clung to the hope that maybe Caleb had gotten lost and was waiting for rescue. But the professionals knew the longer a person was missing without supplies, the slimmer their chances became. Caleb had only carried a small water bottle and a snack bar. That was never going to sustain him for long. Searchers pressed deeper into the woods, leaving marked trails to probe dense brush and uneven ridges. They found deer tracks, raccoon prints, and fallen branches, but no trace of Caleb. Some said it was as though the forest itself had chosen to conceal him. The phrase began to spread quietly among volunteers. The trail had swallowed him. It was meant as a figure of speech, but the longer the search stretched, the more real it felt. By the third day, the community was fully mobilized. Flyers with Caleb's face appeared on gas station windows, taped to stop signs, shared endlessly online. His classmates gathered in prayer circles, lighting candles as dusk fell. Neighbors cooked meals for the search teams. Everyone wanted to believe he would walk out of the forest at any moment, embarrassed by the commotion he caused. But the woods gave no reassurance, only silence. The authorities vowed to continue. They told Caleb's parents that missing person cases often broke open with just a single clue: a shoe, a piece of clothing, a discarded item overlooked the first time. All they needed was one sign to guide them. But that sign never came. Instead, what grew was a sense of dread, a gnawing awareness that something beyond an accident might be unfolding. And as the days dragged into nights, the volunteers and deputies alike began to wonder whether they were searching for a boy still alive or for something far more grim. By the fourth day, the search for Caleb had grown into something far larger than a routine missing person case. What had begun with local deputies and a handful of volunteers now stretched into a full-scale operation involving county search and rescue teams, specialized trackers, and even state resources. Command posts were set up at the trailhead, buzzing with radios, maps, and exhausted volunteers, trying to make sense of an unfolding mystery that seemed to deepen with every hour. Authorities widened the search perimeter in all directions, but every new sweep returned with the same answer: nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sound in the forest that pointed to where Caleb had gone. Search dogs were redeployed that morning. Handlers brought in multiple teams from different counties, believing that fresh noses and rested animals might succeed where the first wave had failed. The dogs initially picked up the same trail as before, their bodies alert as they followed Caleb's faint scent from the gravel parking lot into the woods. But once again, less than a mile in, at a section where the trail hardened into rocky ground, they stopped. Some paced in circles, confused. Others whined and pulled back as if the trail had evaporated. To handlers, it was deeply unsettling. Scents fade, yes, but rarely this abruptly. Caleb's trail seemed to end at the rocks, as though he had stepped off the earth entirely. Helicopters were launched at first light, their blades thundering over the forest canopy. From the air, searchers leaned out, scanning for any break in the trees, any flash of color that might belong to Caleb's shirt or backpack. But the forest was unyielding. Its dense green cover masked every inch of ground, turning the search into a game of chance. Pilots circled low over ravines and rivers, but the terrain offered no cooperation. Even infrared cameras designed to pick up heat signatures struggled beneath the thick canopy. To those in the air, it was as if the forest was deliberately keeping its secret. On the ground, the search became grueling. Volunteers trudged for hours through mud, brambles, and uneven ridges, their voices hoarse from shouting Caleb's name. Deputies methodically checked drainage ditches, caves, and crevices, probing with poles and flashlights. At night, the forest grew unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made even experienced rescuers uneasy. More than one searcher admitted privately that the woods felt different, almost hostile, as though it resisted their presence. Meanwhile, Caleb's family refused to give up hope. His parents set up a table near the trailhead with stacks of missing posters, handing them to anyone willing to distribute them in nearby towns. His younger sister sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the tree line as if willing him to walk back out. Friends canvassed gas stations, diners, and rural roads with flyers, plastering his face wherever they could. In the photos, Caleb smiled easily, unaware that his likeness would soon become the centerpiece of a desperate search. As the case gained traction, whispers began to circulate through the community. Locals who had lived near the forest for decades shared hushed stories of other disappearances: hunters who wandered too far, campers who never came home, even children who had strayed from family picnics. Most of those stories had been dismissed as cautionary tales, the kind parents tell to scare children into staying close. But now, with Caleb missing, those old stories began to feel heavier, less like myths and more like warnings that had been ignored. Some began to wonder aloud if this forest had a pattern, a history of swallowing people without a trace. The sheriff's office pushed back against speculation, insisting the search remained active and focused. Still, the unease spread. Reporters arrived, cameras aimed at Caleb's family as they pleaded for help. News vans parked near the command post, turning the once quiet trailhead into a hive of activity. To the outside world, Caleb's disappearance was just another tragic story. To the people living in that town, it was a wound that cut deep. Every day he remained missing made the community feel more vulnerable, as though something unseen was moving just beyond the trees. Rescue crews doubled their efforts, mapping out grids that extended miles beyond where Caleb had last been seen. They searched riverbanks, caves, and abandoned cabins scattered in the woods. Nothing turned up. Even survival experts brought in to consult admitted confusion. If Caleb had tried to walk out of the forest, he should have crossed a road or been spotted by now. If he had fallen, some trace should have been found. Yet there was nothing. By the end of the week, exhaustion set in. Volunteers who had once shown up in droves began to dwindle, worn down by long days and longer nights. Deputies rotated in and out, their optimism fading. Caleb's parents remained at the trailhead, refusing to leave until there were answers. For them, hope was all that remained, even as it clashed with the growing silence around them. But for the searchers who kept going deeper into the forest, unease began to outweigh determination. It wasn't just that Caleb had vanished. It was how quickly, how cleanly, without any of the usual signs that might suggest where he went. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, as though there was more to this disappearance than anyone yet understood. And though no one would say it out loud, the question lingered in every rescuer's mind. If Caleb could vanish this way, who might be next? Investigators knew that if they were going to find Caleb, they had to retrace his last known movements with absolute precision. In the days after his disappearance, deputies canvassed the area, questioning hikers who had been on the trail the same afternoon. A few recalled seeing a boy matching Caleb's description walking steadily toward the ridge overlook. He carried a small day pack, nothing unusual, and he didn't appear distressed. But no one remembered seeing him come back down. To investigators, that detail stood out. The overlook was a natural stopping point, a place where hikers usually paused before turning back. If Caleb had reached it, something may have happened there. Detectives pulled his phone records. The last signal registered was a weak ping from a tower near the cliffs, time-stamped late that afternoon. After that, the device went silent. No further pings, no outgoing texts, no calls. It was as though the phone had been shut off, smashed, or dropped somewhere out of range. Given Caleb's reputation for responsibility, investigators doubted he had turned it off willingly. The silence of the device became one of the first real clues, and it pointed them toward the ridge. Search teams were redirected there immediately. The ridge overlook was beautiful but unforgiving. The trail narrowed as it climbed, bordered by loose gravel and jagged rocks. From the top, the view stretched for miles, but just beyond the railing of trees was a sharp drop into a steep ravine. It wasn't difficult to imagine how a simple misstep could send someone tumbling. Searchers scoured the area carefully, eyes trained on every rock and crevice. What they found was enough to raise alarms. Near the edge of the overlook, investigators noticed a patch of scuffed dirt, as though someone had slid or struggled. A branch jutting out over the drop was freshly snapped, the wood splintered clean. At first glance, the evidence suggested Caleb may have fallen. For rescuers, the discovery was devastating. They set up lines and lowered themselves into the ravine below, hoping to find him injured but alive. For hours they combed the slope, pushing through thick brush, probing rocky crevices, even scanning the river that ran through the bottom of the gorge. But there was nothing. No body, no clothing, not even a shoe. The absence of remains where signs of a fall were so strong created a chilling contradiction. If Caleb had gone over the edge, he should have been there. Searchers returned again and again, each time widening their sweep, certain they had missed something, but each time the ravine yielded nothing. The discovery of scuffed dirt and a broken branch, once promising as a lead, became instead a haunting reminder of how little they knew. Investigators considered other possibilities. Could Caleb have staged his own disappearance, leaving the trail intentionally? Those who knew him best rejected the theory immediately. He had no history of running away, no conflicts with family or friends that would drive him to vanish. He had left his car locked at the trailhead, his wallet inside. Nothing suggested premeditation, and if he had walked away willingly, why would the phone cut off exactly at the ridge? Some rescuers theorized that perhaps Caleb had fallen, but not where they expected. The terrain beyond the cliffs was riddled with hidden dangers, sinkholes, sudden drop-offs, dense thickets that could conceal a person entirely. There were also small caves and narrow fissures in the rock face, many invisible from the surface. An unlucky step could send someone into a gap that would swallow them whole, leaving no sign for searchers above. The possibilities weighed heavily on the rescue crews. Each day they returned to the ridge, re-examining the evidence, trying to picture Caleb's final movements. Some believed the scuffed dirt indicated he had slipped. Others thought the branch may have broken as he grabbed it in panic, trying to catch himself. But the complete lack of a body or belongings cast doubt on every theory. Even in accidents, something is usually left behind: a hat, a water bottle, a scrap of clothing. Here, there was nothing. For Caleb's family, the ridge became an unbearable place. His parents visited only once, led by deputies who showed them the site. They stared silently at the overlook, the drop beyond, the tree with its broken branch. His mother wept, clinging to the belief that if he had fallen, he would have been found. His father remained stoic, but later admitted that standing there felt like looking into a void, a place that had taken his son and refused to give him back. By the end of the second week, the ridge investigation had reached a standstill. Deputies could not prove Caleb had fallen, but they could not disprove it either. The scuffed dirt and broken branch remained the only physical signs of his trail, yet they offered no resolution. For the searchers, it was a torment: clues without answers, evidence without explanation. The forest seemed to mock their efforts, revealing just enough to keep hope alive while concealing the truth. Theories multiplied in town. Some whispered that Caleb had been taken, perhaps intercepted by someone near the overlook. Others clung to the belief he was still out there, injured, waiting to be found. The more rational explanation remained a fall, but without a body, it was impossible to confirm. The ridge became a symbol of the case: ominous, mysterious, and unspeakably cruel. And for investigators, it marked the point where the search shifted from hopeful recovery to grim uncertainty, as they realized they were no longer chasing a straightforward accident, but a mystery far more complicated than they had imagined. By the second week of the search, exhaustion had seeped into every corner of the operation. What had begun with determination and urgency was now weighed down by fatigue, confusion, and a creeping sense of futility. Crews pressed deeper into the forest, combing areas well beyond the original perimeter. Each day began with a briefing, maps spread across tables, grid assignments marked in bright ink. Each night ended with those same maps scarred with notes of failure. Nothing found, no trace, no sign of Caleb. Early in that week, a flicker of hope surfaced. A set of footprints was discovered along a muddy section of trail nearly 2 miles from the ridge. The prints were roughly the size Caleb would wear, angled sharply into thick undergrowth. Searchers felt a surge of optimism. Finally, a tangible lead. Teams rushed to follow the tracks, marking each step with flags and tape. But as the trail stretched on, inconsistencies appeared. Some prints were too shallow for a teenage boy carrying a pack. Others seemed to belong to different shoes entirely. When forensic examiners studied them closely, they determined the tracks were too degraded and too mixed with animal prints to be considered conclusive. The hope that had sprung up was crushed, replaced by a heavier weight than before. Days later, another lead emerged that rattled the entire search. Deep in the woods, miles from the main trail, a volunteer stumbled across a tattered hoodie draped over a fallen log. The fabric was torn, weathered, but still intact enough to be recognized. Word spread quickly through the camp. Caleb's mother was called in to identify it. She clutched the hoodie, scanning its frayed seams, desperately trying to decide if it was her son's. For a brief moment, the entire search effort shifted. Reporters caught wind of the discovery, cameras crowded the trailhead, and whispers of a breakthrough electrified the town. But the truth, when it came, was devastating. The hoodie didn't belong to Caleb. It belonged to another missing hiker who had vanished in the region nearly 4 years earlier. his case long gone cold. The forest had given up a clue, but it belonged to another family, another grief. For Caleb's parents, the revelation was almost unbearable, as if the woods were mocking their desperation with reminders of how long such mysteries could linger unresolved. With each false lead, pressure on investigators mounted. Local news stations covered the search nightly, their anchors repeating the same haunting phrases: "No trace, vanished without a clue, family left waiting." National outlets began to pick up the story, framing it against a backdrop of other disappearances in American wilderness areas. Some commentators speculated about predators, both human and animal. Others questioned law enforcement's competence, asking how a teenager could vanish in daylight on a trail so close to town without leaving any evidence. The media attention galvanized volunteers, but placed unbearable weight on the sheriff's department. Every dead lead now came with scrutiny, every mistake magnified under the camera's lens. For Caleb's family, the second week became a cycle of hope and despair. His parents camped out near the command post, clinging to any rumor, any scrap of information that might bring them closer to answers. One moment they believed he was still alive, perhaps injured, but surviving in some hidden corner of the woods. The next moment, they were forced to confront the possibility of something darker, that their son had been taken or killed, his body hidden too well for even the most experienced searchers to find. His sister refused to leave the site, spending hours staring at the tree line, whispering that she could feel he was still out there. At night, the forest grew colder, the air damp and heavy. Searchers lit fires at camp, huddled in silence after long shifts. Some admitted privately that the case had begun to feel cursed. First the dead-end footprints, then the false hope of the hoodie, now the growing weight of national scrutiny. Each night that Caleb remained missing without answers made the possibility of recovery less likely. For many, it was no longer a question of when he would be found, but whether he ever would be. The days blurred into one another, the search expanding wider with diminishing returns. Deputies sent teams to remote hunting cabins, drainage ditches, and even abandoned wells. Every shadow seemed worth exploring, every lead chased down no matter how faint. Yet each time they came back empty-handed, the sense of dread grew stronger. The forest, vast and unyielding, seemed determined to keep its secret. For Caleb's parents, the cruelty of the false leads was sharper than silence. Hope lifted them up only to drop them harder with each disappointment. His mother confessed to friends that she no longer knew which was worse, believing he was alive and suffering, or believing he was gone forever. His father, stoic in front of cameras, admitted privately to sleepless nights where he replayed Caleb's last steps over and over in his mind. They clung to each other, refusing to leave the search site, unwilling to accept a life without answers. By the end of that second week, the momentum of the search began to slow. Resources were stretched thin, volunteers exhausted, law enforcement strained. The false leads had left scars, and even the most determined searchers began to whisper doubts. Yet through it all, the family's conviction did not waver. They insisted Caleb was still out there, alive, waiting to be found. Their hope was fragile, battered by disappointment, but it was all they had left. And for investigators, that fragile hope was enough to keep them pressing forward, even as the forest continued to yield nothing but silence and shadows. As the third week of the search began, investigators faced a troubling reality. Every obvious lead had been exhausted, yet Caleb was no closer to being found. Maps stretched across the command post showed grids upon grids of terrain that had already been covered, some areas searched twice, even 3 times. Yet the woods remained stubbornly mute. It was then, in hushed conversations over coffee and in the quiet pauses between briefings, that locals began to share a different kind of story. They spoke of caves hidden deep within the forest, dark, unstable places known only to hunters, explorers, and children who once dared each other to enter. These caves, they warned, were easy to miss and even easier to get trapped inside. The mention of caves unsettled the rescuers. Up until then, the working theory had been a fall from the ridge or an intentional walk-off trail. But the idea of Caleb stumbling into a cave, either for shelter or out of curiosity, introduced a new and terrifying possibility. Underground, voices wouldn't carry. Heat-sensing equipment from helicopters couldn't penetrate. Dogs couldn't track past certain depths. If he had fallen into one of those voids, there was a chance he was still there, alive at first, unheard by the world above. For the search teams, it was a haunting thought. Debate sparked quickly among the rescuers. Some argued that the caves were too dangerous to risk. Many entrances were little more than narrow cracks in limestone, leading to unstable chambers prone to collapse. Even trained cavers hesitated to explore without proper gear. Others insisted they had no choice. If Caleb had crawled into one, the search could never be considered complete without checking them. The parents, when told of the theory, begged authorities to look. They didn't care about the risks. If there was even a chance their son was down there, every cave needed to be searched, so teams shifted their focus. Guided by locals who remembered the locations, rescuers began probing known caves one by one. The first few were shallow, little more than hollows in rock faces. They held nothing but damp air, scattered leaves, and the stench of animal dens. In one, searchers found piles of bones, but closer inspection revealed them to be deer, dragged in and consumed by predators. Another cave ended abruptly in a wall of collapsed rock, jagged slabs piled over what might once have been a deeper tunnel. Each discovery was unsettling, but none pointed to Caleb. The deeper they went, the more the idea gnawed at them. Some searchers admitted they couldn't sleep at night, imagining him alone in the dark, his voice hoarse from shouting, waiting for help that never came. The thought that he might have been only feet away from them during earlier sweeps was unbearable. Every crack in the ground, every shadow at the base of a ridge began to feel like an accusation, daring them to look closer. The caves also stirred memories of past tragedies. Several older residents recalled stories of hunters or explorers who had vanished in those same woods decades earlier. In many of those cases, searchers had whispered the same theory, that the caves had swallowed them. Those bodies were never recovered, and the stories faded into local folklore. Now, with Caleb gone, those tales resurfaced with new weight. To the families who told them, it felt less like legend and more like a grim pattern repeating itself. Teams pressed on. Specialized spelunkers were called in, equipped with helmets, lights, and ropes. They descended into tight spaces, their voices echoing off damp stone walls. Hours passed as they crawled through narrow passages, mapping each chamber. Again and again, they emerged empty-handed, covered in mud and frustration. For every cave they cleared, dozens more remained unsearched, some too small to risk, others hidden entirely. It was a race against time they knew they were losing. The sheriff's department struggled with the decision of how far to pursue the cave theory. Each search carried risks not just for Caleb, but for the rescuers themselves. A collapse could kill an entire team. And yet, the alternative, walking away from the possibility that he was trapped underground, felt unthinkable. The weight of that choice sat heavily on the rescuers, eating at their morale. Some openly admitted that the caves haunted them more than the ridge. Falling was tragic, yes, but at least it was swift. Being trapped in a lightless chamber, slowly fading, was a nightmare no one wanted to consider. By the end of the week, the cave searches had yielded little more than unease. Bones of animals, scraps of old camping gear, collapsed passages that mocked them with the possibility of what lay beyond. Nothing tied directly to Caleb. But the idea could not be dismissed. For every lead that faded, the caves remained as silent, menacing possibilities, waiting to be explored or ignored at great cost. When rescuers gathered at night, their conversations often returned to the same question. What if he was down there all along, beneath their feet, unheard and unreachable? The thought was enough to keep them going, even as exhaustion pulled them toward despair. And though no one said it aloud, the caves had shifted the search entirely. It was no longer just a hunt through the forest. It was a battle with the dark places hidden beneath it, places that might hold not just answers, but horrors none of them were prepared to face. It had been nearly a month since Caleb vanished, and for many of the volunteers, the search had become more about persistence than expectation. The large crowds had thinned, the news cameras had moved on, and the faces at the trailhead were now mostly the hardened few who could not bring themselves to stop looking. Among them were a handful of experienced backcountry searchers who believed the only way forward was to push into the most remote, least accessible sections of the forest. places where casual hikers would never go, where the undergrowth was so thick it could swallow a person whole. It was during one of these grueling sweeps several miles from the ridge overlook that a pair of searchers noticed something unusual. A cluster of brush, oddly arranged against a wall of boulders, caught their eye. At first it looked like nothing more than tangled vegetation, but as they cleared the branches, they revealed a narrow opening in the rock, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The entrance was easy to miss, so well hidden that someone could pass within feet of it and never notice. It didn't appear on any of the maps the teams had studied, nor had locals mentioned it. The opening was jagged, with sharp stone edges and a faint draft of cold, damp air spilling outward. The rescuers exchanged uneasy looks. After weeks of whispered theories about caves, here was one concealed almost deliberately, waiting in silence to be uncovered. They marked the location, radioed their find to the command post, and prepared to enter. One of the volunteers clipped on a headlamp and crouched low, forcing his body into the darkness. The passage was tight, scraping against shoulders before widening suddenly into a small chamber. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying the smell of earth and stone. As the beam of light swept across the ground, it revealed something that made his stomach clench. A snapped plastic flashlight lay against the wall, its casing cracked, batteries scattered. A few feet away, a water bottle rested on its side, the same brand and style Caleb had been known to carry on his hikes. The discoveries froze the team in place. For weeks they had searched blindly, chasing theories and finding only disappointment. But here, at last, were objects that felt tangible, personal, and almost certainly tied to him. The excitement was tempered by dread, because if Caleb had been here, the cave was no refuge. The floor was marked with scuffs, faint shoe impressions in the thin dust coating the stone. They led deeper into the passage, angled downward into heavier darkness. The rescuers emerged from the chamber to brief the larger team. Word spread quickly through the command post. They had found a cave, and this time there were signs of Caleb. His parents were notified, though details were kept minimal, the sheriff unwilling to raise hopes too soon. Still, the mood shifted. After weeks of silence, the forest had finally given them something. When the larger team returned to the site, they studied the scuffed shoe marks carefully. They were too fresh to belong to long-ago explorers and too small to have been made by adult cavers. One deputy pressed his palm against the impressions, comparing them to Caleb's known shoe size. It was close enough to send a chill through the group. For the first time since the ridge, there was a trail leading somewhere. But where it led was into a darkness few were eager to face. Specialists were called in, cavers with training in navigating unstable underground spaces. They secured ropes, checked air quality, and slowly began their descent. The passage twisted downward, narrow at first before opening into larger sections. The scuff marks continued, sometimes faint, sometimes pressed deeply as though Caleb had stumbled or dragged his feet. Every step forward carried the possibility of answers, but also the weight of what those answers might mean. The cave was far larger than anyone anticipated. It branched into side tunnels, some collapsing into dead ends, others vanishing into black voids that stretched far beyond the reach of their lamps. The walls were damp, streaked with mineral stains, and the floor uneven with loose stone. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely, where even whispers echoed back distorted. For the rescuers, the air felt heavy, pressing against their chests with each breath. As they pressed deeper, one volunteer paused to examine the snapped flashlight again. The break was recent, the edges of the plastic clean, not worn by years of decay. The batteries were corroded slightly from moisture, but not long abandoned. Someone had used it, and not long ago. The realization brought with it a sickening wave of guilt. If Caleb had crawled in here with only a weak flashlight and a water bottle, he may have been alive for hours, maybe days, waiting for a rescue that never came. The weight of that thought gnawed at the rescuer's conscience. They had spent weeks scouring ridges, ditches, and false leads, while Caleb may have been calling out from underground, unheard. The silence that followed in the chamber was thick, no one wanting to voice what they were thinking. If he had been here, then this cave had held him captive all along, hidden in plain sight. Yet the scuff marks continued forward, deeper into the labyrinth. With every foot they advanced, Hope and dread intertwined, hope that the trail would finally bring them to him, dread of what they might actually find waiting in the depths. By the end of that day, the team had only begun to map the cave's true reach. But one thing was certain, the search was no longer just about a missing boy in the woods. The forest had given them an opening, and behind it lay a darkness that promised either answers or nightmares. The cave had already unsettled the rescuers when they first entered, but as investigators returned in the days that followed with more specialized teams, unease began to harden into dread. What had at first seemed like a tragic accident site was starting to tell a different story, one written in the walls themselves. As light swept across the stone, investigators noticed faint but deliberate gouges etched into the rock face near a steep incline leading upward. At first, they appeared like scratches from natural erosion, but closer inspection revealed something different. The marks were uneven, ragged, the kind made by fingernails or the desperate scraping of a hand clutching at stone. When one rescuer pressed his palm into the grooves, the width aligned almost perfectly. Someone had clawed at this rock, fighting to climb back toward the surface. The discovery stopped the team cold. It was no longer just a question of whether Caleb had entered the cave. The markings suggested he had been alive, struggling in terror, trying to escape. The image that formed in everyone's mind was unbearable. A teenage boy, trapped in suffocating darkness, his nails breaking as he tried to climb, calling out for help that never came. For the first time, searchers admitted aloud what they had only whispered before, that if Caleb had been here, he hadn't simply walked in by mistake. The sense of something darker grew when another investigator, scanning a narrow side crevice, spotted strands of material wedged deep in the rock. With gloves, he pulled them free. Frayed rope fibers, weathered but unmistakable. Not far from it, a wad of duct tape peeled away from stone, its edges brittle but still sticky in places. The items were not the kind a hiker carried for recreation. They were tools of restraint. The rescuers exchanged silent, horrified looks. Caleb may not have crawled into this cave at all. He may have been forced. The mood in the cave shifted instantly. For weeks, searchers had clung to the hope of rescue, the idea that Caleb had simply gotten lost or injured. But with rope and duct tape lying in the shadows, the narrative changed. This was not just a missing person search. It was potentially a crime scene. Deputies began photographing everything, sealing off sections of the cave and calling in forensic specialists. Where before they had shouted Caleb's name into the dark, now they moved with a hushed clinical caution, knowing that any misstep could destroy evidence. The discovery sent shockwaves back to the command post. Parents who had endured weeks of torment were told of the new findings, though details were softened to spare them the worst. Even so, the implication was unavoidable. Their son had not simply disappeared into the forest. He may have been taken, held against his will, hidden in a place where no one would think to look. The cruelty of the possibility hollowed out what little strength they had left. For Caleb's mother, the thought of him alive in the darkness, bound and terrified, was almost too much to bear. As investigators pushed further, they found more unsettling details. In one chamber, the scuffed shoe prints appeared erratic, circling as though someone had paced or struggled. In another, a section of stone was darkened with smudges, as if hands had pressed there repeatedly, leaving faint traces over time. No body was found, but the space carried an undeniable presence, as though it still held echoes of what had happened there. Rescuers described the atmosphere as oppressive, a silence so thick it felt alive. Some refused to go back after their first entry, saying the cave carried a weight that made breathing difficult. The sheriff's office now faced a grim reality. What began as a search and rescue mission had shifted into a criminal investigation. The cave was sealed with crime scene tape, guards posted at the entrance. The FBI was contacted, their experience in abduction cases needed for what was now being treated as potential foul play. Maps of the cave were drawn, every chamber labeled, every discovery logged. But even with the new direction, questions piled up faster than answers. Who could have dragged Caleb into this place? Why here, so far from the trail? And most haunting of all, how long had he survived in that darkness before the cave swallowed the sound of his voice? In town, rumors multiplied. Some whispered about recluses who lived off the grid in the backcountry, men who had been seen wandering alone near trailheads. Others believed the cave had long been a dumping ground for crimes, a hidden prison no one dared to explore until now. The uncertainty fed fear. Parents warned their children away from the woods, hikers stopped venturing onto the trails, and an entire community began to feel that something sinister had been lurking at their doorstep all along. Inside the cave, the evidence grew heavier with every discovery, but the absence of Caleb himself was unbearable. Investigators walked away each night knowing that if he had been here, the clues suggested he had not gone willingly, and whatever he endured had been deliberate. The scratches, the rope, the tape, they told a story no parent wanted to hear. And yet, it was the only story the cave was willing to give them. For the searchers who had once held on to hope, the cave became a place of nightmares. They had entered believing they were chasing an accident, but left convinced they were looking at a crime that went far deeper. And though no one wanted to voice it outright, the silence inside those chambers whispered the question that would not go away. If Caleb had been dragged here, who was responsible? And how close might they still be to the forest that had concealed their secret for so long? When forensic teams returned to the cave, they came prepared in a way the first rescuers had not. They carried ultraviolet lights, chemical sprays, and high-resolution cameras designed to capture details invisible to the naked eye. The cave that had once seemed like a natural void now transformed into something more deliberate, almost like a hidden room filled with a silent testimony. As beams of light crawled across the walls, investigators froze. Scratched into the stone, faint but unmistakable, were crude etchings, letters, shapes, and symbols carved with a sharp object or perhaps even fingernails. At first they appeared random, but soon a pattern emerged, initials, numbers lined in sequence like tally marks. And then, the one detail that stopped everyone cold, a name. Caleb. The letters were jagged, uneven, and desperate. His name had been carved into the wall again and again, some shallow, others pressed deep enough to split the stone's surface. For investigators, it was confirmation that Caleb had not only been inside this cave, but that he had survived long enough to leave behind his presence. The realization hung heavy in the air. Every mark was a message, an attempt to resist disappearing, to say, "I was here." The forensic team carefully photographed each etching. Alongside his name, they found what looked like a series of tally marks scratched in uneven lines. Some grouped in fives, others scattered without order, as though time had blurred in the dark. It was impossible to know whether they marked days, hours, or just attempts to keep his mind from unraveling. Among the markings were single words, cold, help, and one partially scratched phrase that appeared to read, "Still here." Each word tore through investigators like a blade. Caleb had been alive in this place, long enough for despair to become etched into stone. Experts examined the carvings closely, noting that the edges were sharp, not dulled by age or erosion. These were recent, made within weeks, not years. The confirmation was devastating. It meant Caleb had lingered, trapped in the cave, fighting to leave behind a trace of himself, even as hope drained away. When news reached his family, the weight of it shattered them. His mother clutched photographs of the etchings, whispering that she could see his hand in every line. His father, normally composed, broke down at the thought that their son had been so close, carving his name into rock while the world above searched blindly. For them, the cave was no longer a theory. It was proof. Proof he had been alive after the day he vanished, proof that he had fought to be remembered, even as the darkness swallowed him whole. The team pressed deeper into the cave, hoping that the markings might lead them toward his final location. The scuffed shoe prints grew fainter, but continued into adjoining chambers. Yet, no body was found, no bones, no clothing beyond what they had already uncovered. The absence was maddening. The walls screamed of Caleb's presence, but his body remained elusive. Some investigators began to voice theories aloud. Perhaps he had been moved. Perhaps whoever had brought him here had returned, removing him before the cave was discovered. The rope and duct tape pointed to human involvement, and now the carvings suggested captivity. It was a horrifying possibility that Caleb had not died naturally in this place, but that someone had come back to erase the last trace of him. Others suggested something more desperate, that he had crawled further in, deeper than they had yet reached, his remains hidden in chambers still unmapped. The cave's vastness loomed over the investigation, its endless branching tunnels a labyrinth of stone that could conceal almost anything. Forensic specialists also uncovered faint stains on one wall, barely visible in natural light but glowing under chemical spray. They were inconclusive, but several believed them to be traces of blood. If true, it only deepened the story etched in the walls, a boy injured, bleeding, yet still alive long enough to scratch his name into stone. The findings leaked to the public, and the story took on new life in the media. Headlines spoke of "the boy in the cave," of carvings that served as his last words. For the community, the revelations were haunting. They no longer saw Caleb as a boy who had simply vanished, but as one who had endured unimaginable terror beneath their feet, his cries unheard while they searched above. Candlelight vigils grew in number, his name whispered with reverence and sorrow. Yet for the investigators, the unanswered question loomed larger than ever. How had he ended up here? If he had stumbled in by accident, why the rope and duct tape? If he had been forced, who had brought him? The cave's silence mocked them with half-answers, forcing them to confront a possibility they were unprepared for. This was no longer just a disappearance. It was a crime hidden in darkness, carried out with a cruelty almost beyond comprehension. By the end of that week, the cave had given them more than they could bear, yet still not enough. Caleb's name carved into stone lingered in their minds, a reminder that he had reached out from the dark, desperate for someone to find him. But without a body, the case teetered in limbo, caught between tragedy and mystery, between proof of suffering and the absence of closure. For the searchers, it became an obsession. If he had left his name behind, there had to be more. And in the silence of the cave, they vowed to keep looking, no matter how deep the darkness stretched. It was in the 5th week of the search, when many believed there was nothing left to uncover, that the cave finally surrendered its darkest secret. A specialist team, determined to map every inch of the underground labyrinth, pressed further than any group had gone before. Their lights caught something unusual near the far end of a twisting corridor, a wall of rock and debris that looked less like a natural barrier and more like the aftermath of a collapse. The air was colder here, heavier, as though the cave itself was guarding what lay beyond. The team marked the area, radioed back to the surface, and began the painstaking work of clearing it stone by stone. Hours turned into days as the rubble was hauled out, each piece revealing more of the chamber beyond. Finally, an opening appeared, just wide enough for one person to crawl through. When the first rescuer shined his light inside, silence fell over the group. The beam illuminated what no one wanted to see but everyone had feared: skeletal remains sprawled against the back wall, clothing in tatters clinging to brittle bones. Beside them lay a collection of objects that told a story far darker than an accidental fall. Caleb's torn clothing was unmistakable, the fabric confirmed by his family later as the same shirt and jeans he had worn on the day he vanished. Near the remains lay his backpack, its contents scattered: a crushed granola bar wrapper, a notebook with damp, ruined pages, and the same brand of water bottle his parents had identified weeks earlier. For investigators, the personal items removed any doubt. This was Caleb, the boy they had searched for day after day, the name they had called into the woods, had been here all along. But what surrounded him was what truly froze the team in place. Burned-out lanterns, their glass fogged with soot, were scattered around the chamber. Pieces of rope, still knotted, lay coiled in the dirt. More duct tape, hardened and stiff, clung to the stone floor where it had once stuck. And on a flat section of rock, someone had left behind scraps of food packaging, cans of beans, packets of jerky that did not belong to Caleb. These were not supplies a 16-year-old carried on a short afternoon hike. They were supplies someone else had brought in, enough to keep him alive for a time. The implications hit like a hammer. Caleb hadn't simply wandered into the cave and become trapped. He had been held here. Someone had kept him in this chamber, cut off from the world, hidden behind a wall of stone. The tally marks and carvings found in the earlier chambers took on new weight, no longer signs of a lost hiker, but of a prisoner marking time, clinging to identity as his captor decided his fate. Forensic teams moved quickly, documenting everything. The remains were carefully recovered and sent for analysis, where DNA confirmed the identity beyond question. Caleb's parents, who had clung to hope far longer than most, were delivered the news no family wants to hear. Their son was gone. But as shattering as that truth was, the details of his final days were even more unbearable. He had not died instantly, not by accident, not by misstep. He had been alive in the dark, confined, waiting for help that never came. The chamber was combed for evidence. Experts studied the lanterns and found they had been lit repeatedly, their soot buildup consistent with extended use. The rope fibers matched those earlier retrieved from crevices, suggesting the restraints had been used more than once. The food remnants were traced back to local convenience stores, brands not found in Caleb's home. The picture became clearer. The cave had not only served as his prison, but had been prepared for it. Someone knew this place well enough to hide supplies inside and to seal it when they were finished. The discovery rippled through the search community, leaving rescuers hollow. For weeks they had told themselves they were chasing an accident. Now they realized they had been walking above a crime scene the entire time, unaware of the cruelty playing out below. Many admitted later that the guilt was unbearable, knowing Caleb may have still been alive during the early days of the search, trapped just beneath their feet. News of the discovery spread quickly, igniting a firestorm of speculation. Reporters broadcast details of the hidden chamber, fueling theories about who could have been responsible. Parents in town clutched their children closer, horrified that someone capable of such cruelty had been living among them. Rumors swirled about drifters, recluses, even people locals had seen camping in the backcountry. The forest, once a place of recreation, now felt tainted, its caves no longer natural wonders, but symbols of a predator's lair. Investigators, meanwhile, faced the grim task of shifting from recovery to pursuit. The cave was no longer just where Caleb had died. It was evidence of premeditation, of captivity, of a crime that demanded answers. Who had chosen this place? Who had sealed him in? The remains of lanterns and food hinted at someone who had planned, someone who had known how to keep a boy hidden for weeks. And if they had done it once, the haunting question became unavoidable. Had they done it before? As Caleb's remains were carried from the cave, searchers stood in silence. Many couldn't meet each other's eyes, their thoughts too heavy to put into words. The truth they had uncovered was worse than the uncertainty that had haunted them. Caleb had been there all along, buried in a chamber sealed from the light, his final days marked by desperation etched into stone. The discovery brought closure, yes, but not peace. It transformed the case into something darker, something that would follow investigators and the community long after the cave was sealed again. The discovery of Caleb's remains transformed the investigation from a desperate search into a hunt for the person responsible. Forensic teams pored over every item recovered from the hidden chamber. The burned-out lanterns, the rope, and the scraps of food packaging became the focal point. Lab analysis revealed fingerprints faintly preserved on one of the cans, smudged but recoverable. When run through databases, the prints matched a local drifter, a man in his late 40s with a long history of violence and petty crime. He had spent years drifting between campsites, shelters, and abandoned cabins, always skirting the edges of town. Locals knew him by sight, but rarely by name. To most, he was a shadow on the periphery, someone better avoided than confronted. Now, he was at the center of everything. Investigators pieced together his background. He had grown up in the area, familiar with the forest and its countless trails, and had spent long stretches living off-grid. His record included assaults, trespassing, and disturbing reports of harassment that had never escalated to formal charges. To those who knew the forest best, it made grim sense. If anyone was capable of using the caves as a hiding place, it was him. The supplies left behind were traced back to local stores where cash purchases matched his known movements. It was circumstantial, but strong enough to bring him in. When deputies finally tracked him down, they found him camping near an abandoned mining road on the edge of the forest. His tent was sparse, his belongings few, But among them were more lanterns identical to those found in the cave. Taken into custody, he was initially defiant, claiming ignorance and accusing investigators of framing him. But as questioning wore on, cracks began to show. Faced with the evidence, the fingerprints, the supplies, the timeline, his bravado faltered. After hours of interrogation, he confessed. The words came slowly, almost detached, as though he was describing someone else's actions. He admitted to seeing Caleb on the trail that afternoon, watching him from a distance. He had followed the boy, then lured him toward the concealed cave entrance. Inside, he restrained him, using the rope and duct tape later found scattered in the chambers. He described the cave not as a hiding place, but as a prison, a place he had prepared over years of wandering. He confessed to using it before, though he offered no names, leaving investigators to wonder whether other disappearances in the region might be tied to him. For Caleb's parents, the confession was both devastating and clarifying. Their son had not simply vanished into the wilderness. He had been taken, hidden, and held in the dark by a man who treated the cave as his secret domain. The pain of knowing what Caleb endured was unbearable, but it ended the torment of not knowing. For the first time, they had the truth. Their boy had been murdered. His death was not an accident or a mystery. It was a crime, one that would finally see justice. The drifter was charged with homicide, unlawful confinement, and multiple counts related to his prior assaults. In court, the details of Caleb's captivity were laid bare. Prosecutors described the tally marks, the carved words, the signs of struggle etched into stone. Jurors were shown images of the chamber, the restraints, the burned-out lanterns. It was a portrait of cruelty that stunned even seasoned attorneys. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For the searchers who had spent weeks combing the forest, the conviction did little to ease the weight they carried. Many admitted they would never forget the cave, not just for what it held, but for how close they had come to missing it. If the brush concealing the entrance had gone unnoticed, Caleb's fate might have remained hidden forever, his name just another among the vanished. The thought haunted them. Some left search and rescue work entirely, unable to return to the woods without hearing echoes of the cave. The community erected a small memorial near the trailhead, where flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes piled up in the weeks following the trial. Caleb's parents visited often, sometimes standing in silence, other times speaking softly as though he could still hear. Closure had come, but it was wrapped in heartbreak. They would never see their son again, never hear his laugh, never watch him grow into the man he should have become. All they had left was the truth, cruel and unrelenting, and the faint comfort that the man responsible could never harm another child again. The cave itself was sealed after the trial, its entrance filled with stone and concrete. Authorities wanted to ensure it could never be used for such horror again. Yet, for those who had entered, the memory of its chambers lingered. They spoke of the silence, the carvings, the overwhelming weight of knowing a boy's final moments had played out in that darkness. The cave was gone, but its shadow remained. In the end, the case left scars on everyone it touched. For Caleb's family, grief was permanent, but tempered by the knowledge that justice had been done. For the searchers, the lesson was harsher, that evil can hide in plain sight, masked by wilderness, waiting for chance to deliver its next victim. And for the community, the forest would never again feel the same. Where once it had been a place of peace, it now carried the memory of a boy lost to the dark and the prison that nearly kept his story buried forever.